Good day. Good afternoon. On behalf of my co-host, John Upham, and I'd like to welcome you to the first TRI Director's Choice Seminar of 2021. First of all, I'd like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and the elders past, present, and emerging. Today's seminar is about clinical trials. It's the first of 3 seminars regarding clinical research, and we will be asking the question, what do we do well and what can we do better regarding clinical trials and how we can link up better with biomedical researchers to improve the clinical trial landscape in Brisbane. We will have 3 short talks followed by a panel discussion involving our 3 speakers and 2 additional speakers talking about the landscape, and John and I will also contribute as both of us have some experience with clinical trials. John, if you can please join to introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahir, and personally, I'd just like to say how gratifying it is to see how many people have joined us in person in the auditorium, and I understand we have a large number of people who've joined us online as well. So look, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Enna Stroil-Salama. Enna has been working with us in the Metro South Research Office for the last 18 months or so on a project that's all to do with implementing the research strategy that was signed off on by the Metro South Board a couple of years ago. And as part of that strategy implementation project, Enna spent a lot of time consulting widely with people who are working in the clinical trials space, particularly to understand what are some of the blockages that are holding people back from doing trials, or making trials less efficient, slower, etc., etc. So without further ado, let's welcome Enna to the podium.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity to speak. So I would like to provide a bit of insight into improving clinical trials from a Metro South perspective, or from a health service perspective, I should say. And just to give you a bit of background about Metro South Health, as many of you might already know, Metro South Health is a major provider of public health services. And in fact, we provide care to 23% of Queensland's population, and that is over 1 million people. We are also the largest Queensland health service by research volume. So this is looking at study numbers in particular, and roughly a quarter of all research studies in Queensland public hospitals are actually conducted at a Metro South Health site. In terms of our trial activity, at the moment, we have nearly 300 active studies, or active clinical trials, I should say. And we have enrolled over 4,000 patients in clinical trials since June 2017. So why do we actually care about clinical trials from a health service perspective? Clinical trials basically form an important part of a learning healthcare system. So that's a system that's self-improving. It is a system where research informs practice and practice informs research. And at the very core of that system, we've got our aim to actually achieve better outcomes for our patients, but also we want to create better value care. In terms of the approach that we've taken at Metro South Health, like John has pointed out, we've actually used our research strategy as a vehicle for us to look at how we can improve things in this context. So we've set out some strategic goals in 2019, and our first step was really to establish a baseline, to look at our context and understand our current state. We wanted to compare where we are now to where we want to be, and really identify the gaps that exist across our health service. And at the same time, we wanted to identify our barriers and enablers. In terms of designing solutions, it was important for us to actually balance our research community needs, our clinical community needs, together with our strengths and resources, but we also wanted to look at the evidence out there. So who has done work in this space and that has worked well? So what are some of those optimal solutions that we want to implement? And the implementation phase is the last step and looking at assessing how effective our solutions are. So with regard to establishing that baseline, we actually undertook a consultation process that was actually informed by our research consumers. And we had an array of people from different professional streams, people with different research experience engaged in this process. But what we found really important is actually to engage all our facilities. The next step was to do a thematic analysis of that consultation data and really identify themes or gaps that exist within our health service that may prevent us, or with respect to also including barriers and enablers, but we really wanted to identify what we needed to do to improve. And what we found in terms of barriers in particular was that in terms of leadership, leaders do not always support research across the health service. That oftentimes research is actually not considered to be true core business, but that there was also insufficient research awareness and recognition. And one of our strongest enablers in this space was that the fact that we do have a strong appetite for research across Metro South Health. In terms of partnerships, engagement, collaborations, our research community found that there were inadequate collaboration opportunities, that they were unable or did not know how to actually effectively engage consumers as partners in research rather than just research participants, and that there were limited interorganisational research networks. What we hope to leverage in this space is our strong and existing partnerships. It is perhaps not too surprisingly that within our health service, we do have competing priorities, but we also have limited space and perhaps not enough research-specific tools. Our research community has also indicated that they would like to see more education in this space. One of our greatest strengths, though, in terms of resources is our research support scheme, which is our Metro South grant scheme. And the final theme that we have identified is support and processes. Research governance has been one of those aspects, I guess, of the research spectrum that is considered quite difficult to execute sometimes. And this is particularly relevant to the clinical trial context and to actually getting the contracts signed off. Now, my apologies. So there was also a mention of there being inadequate guidance and mentoring and suboptimal transparency of research finance. Our greatest strength in this area, and this actually applies across all of the gaps that we've identified, is the fact that we have a strong research track record and a lot of research expertise across our health service. So when designing our solutions, we first started looking at international best practice, and the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance has actually done a scoping activity where they were trying to identify key elements that contribute to effective embedding of clinical trials at a health service. And what they have found is 6 key topics or 6 key elements that needed to be included. And these included culture and values of research, a skilled research workforce, public awareness. They spoke about trial design and embedding, enabling infrastructure, but also around having proportionate regulation and governance. So we're already starting to see some similarities between these and the gaps that we've identified at Metro South Health. We have then become aware of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, and this framework was drafted by the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. And what it does, it actually adds a clinical trial component to an existing accreditation process for hospitals. In comparison to the international best practice, though, it actually adds consumer centricity. It adds very specific actions and measures to improve ethics and governance processes as well. We identified a number of exemplar solutions from similar contexts. So in this case, it was the Hunter New England Local Health District. And their focus really was on the partnership between researchers and clinicians to enable integration of clinical trials and research and clinical services. Now, embedding researchers in health services, as they've identified, actually improves research translation. it improves health service and performance, but it also maximizes sort of bidirectional knowledge transfer. They have emphasized that co-contribution of resources must actually produce co-benefits, but also that when you introduce these changes, as you're including researchers across the organization, that the benefits of that actually accrue over time. So in terms of our solutions for Metro South Health, we've actually developed an action plan and a more detailed implementation plan. And we have really focused on those gaps that we've identified through the consultation. So in terms of the culture theme, these are probably some of the solutions that are relevant to clinical trials. We want to introduce an audit and feedback mechanism to not only improve our research performance, but also to create buy-in. We want to have research promotion activities that are both internally and externally facing. In terms of engagement and partnerships, we really want to simplify and have clearer processes for conjoint and honorary appointments. But we want to create collaboration platforms and incentivize collaboration through grants. In terms of resources, there is a significant focus on research education and providing tools to our research community. But we also want to have a person that's a single point of contact that will take contracts from the negotiation stage all the way to the execution stage to really accelerate that research governance process. In terms of support, we want to strengthen our networks and really strengthen those peer-to-peer connections and improve mentoring. But we also want to introduce actions that will actually enable the implementation of the National Clinical Governance Framework and many more. So these are only some of the actions that we have included in our action and implementation plans. What we haven't done, though, is engage sponsors, and that is exactly what our Department of Health has done. So only a couple of weeks ago, we have been informed that they're currently in the process of drafting a strategic action plan for increasing clinical trial activity in Queensland. And what they have found from sponsors is that Queensland is particularly slow and in terms of startup times for clinical trials. And what our department will actually focus on is accelerating governance processes in particular. And what is interesting that their recommendations, their draft recommendations actually include many of the things that we've included in our action plan, which gives us confidence that we're on the right track to improving how clinical trials are conducted at Metro South Health. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Enya. So our next speaker today is Associate Professor Jake Begun. He comes to us hot-footed from a clinic that he ran. He is the head of the inflammatory bowel disease group at NADA Research. He's well-renowned in his field, and his interests include innovative new therapies, the microbiome, and innate immunity. Thank you, Jake.
Fabulous. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about our experiences. I thought that previous presentation was right on. I was nodding along when I saw a lot of the barriers that we come across in day-to-day practice. I thought that I would just do one slide, I promise, on inflammatory bowel disease, which is a passion of mine, just to give some context to the sort of things that we do in our unit. Inflammatory bowel disease is a chronic inflammatory condition of the gut. I'm a gastroenterologist, so I spend a lot of time with these patients. My practice is probably about 90% of IBD, and it includes two diseases, typically Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. The age of onset of this disease is typically in patients who are in their teenage years or in their early 20s. It's a lifelong condition. It often requires chronic immunosuppression, biologic therapy, steroid use, and not infrequently involves surgery to remove parts of the diseased bowel. Australia has the privilege of being one of the highest rates of inflammatory bowel disease in the world, probably thanks to a variety of things, including genetics, our environment, and our diets. And the standard of care for this disease, as I mentioned, is immunosuppressants as well as biologic agents. Some of these you might have heard of, like anti-TNF agents, anti-integrins, or anti-IL-12 and 23. These are generally given as intravenous or subcutaneous infusions. They're extremely expensive. For example, anti-IL-12/23 therapy, which is Stelara. A vial of Stelara will run you about $9,000, and that's given every 8 weeks. Furthermore, standard of care, including these agents, results in only 30% of patients achieving clinical remission in randomized controlled trials. And so there's a large unmet need in this area, which is why it's a global focus for clinical trial activity. So to set that stage. So I manage the IBD group, both the clinical side of things, a translational lab here, and our IBD clinical trials unit. And I guess if I had to do a very, very crude Venn diagram, my PowerPoint skills are rudimentary at best. I would say that we lie here, and at the Mater, we kind of are within Mater Research, but we also interact very closely with Mater Health, where our patients are located for the most part. Mater Health, I guess I would say, includes the public and private systems, which both feed in. We also behind this have a referral network across Brisbane and across Queensland for access to clinical trials. Within that, we're looking at the gastro department within Mater, but also I have a lab here at the TRI. And I think that the clinical trials unit sits at the center of this effort, this translational effort in this space. So what we do with the clinical trials unit, well, in the IBD unit, is we provide, of course, excellent clinical care to our patients. And I think that fundamentally part of providing excellent care is the opportunity to participate in trials. I think that's a fundamental aspect of clinical care. We offer sponsored clinical trials, and this is very important to our group. Also investigator-initiated clinical trials as part of network. So we have a Australia, New Zealand IBD consortium network, which is 20 hospitals and IBD centers around Australia, New Zealand that collaborate on investigator-initiated research. And also the opportunity to participate in translational research. And I think when given the opportunity, many patients really feel that this is a valuable contribution that they can make to furthering our understanding of this disease. And when given the opportunity, I think most people actually jump at it in order to participate. For example, in our biobank, where we've collected over 500 samples now from patients. And we also do basic and translational research, which our patients love to hear when I tell them that we've cured IBD in mice, and they say, when can you use it on me? As far as our structure, I thought that I would just do some practicalities in terms of how we've built our unit, because when I first came to the Mater, it was 2 PIs and 1 research coordinator, and we've grown significantly. We now have 7 people in our CTU team. And we've separated out in teams to try and streamline activities. So we have a team that works on sponsored clinical trials, which is a core part of our, I guess I'll call it business, which include a couple of research nurse coordinators and research assistants. And then we have an investigator-initiated study time, which are 2 full-time research assistants on that team. A translational team, which includes a research assistant for collection of samples, and then lab-based folks. We also have a dedicated site admin, as was indicated before. The governance structures governing clinical trials activities in Australia, in Queensland, at the Mater are incredibly complex and require a full-time person to actually navigate those complexities. And then we also have research fellows embedded, 2 research fellows who are embedded in the team who are completing their gastroenterology training. I think that to make a team perform well, there are a couple of elements that I've learned over the past half a decade of working in this unit. And I think in that having goal-driven performance is really helpful. It's a lot of work. Our team put in a lot of effort, and it's not just because they get a paycheck at the end of the day, it's because they understand the impact that we're making in our patients' lives. And I think that emphasizing those goals on a weekly basis, at least, if not a daily basis, is very helpful so that they know why they're getting up in the morning. And I think that they buy into it and believe in it. I do. And that is tailored to individual team members. Initially, we tried to kind of put people into holes, and sometimes fitting square pegs into round holes doesn't work. And so we try to play up to people's strengths, having our nurses do activities around clinical trials that are more nursing focused, and have our research admin doing admin stuff, and having our research assistants doing appropriate tasks has helped a lot. And then ownership of projects. So we appoint people on individual projects so that they have some ownership of the project. I think that also gets people invested and motivated in clinical trial space. And we're constantly looking at ways to improve efficiency, which is a big challenge in this space, both from sponsors and local governance and hospitals. I think that one of the key things about running a trials unit, as I've learned, is that you have to be in the black, and that's a really important concept. And so for me, that means that we're using sponsored clinical trial activity to subsidize investigator-initiated studies, which are very important and dear to my heart. So in terms of that, when we're looking at sponsored trials, we're being very selective. I get clinical trials offers every week or 2, and I say no to the majority of them. And I think we're very selective what we want. We want trials that we'll have good recruitment, and that usually reflects that they're good trial design that patients are interested in and that fit with our patient profile, that they're well remunerated. If we're doing trials for someone else, we should be remunerated for it, and that there's feasibility. And in fact, there was one trial that slipped through the radar where we realized that they were actually looking to get 100 mils of blood per study visit. And we got on like, oh my goodness, we hadn't quite picked up on that until the very end. Efficient and accurate invoicing is important. This is actually really complicated. And even things like clinical trials management systems and software, it's hard to get this area right. And it's something that we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do it properly. In fact, when we first brought in someone to audit, we found $80,000 of missing invoices that we hadn't invoiced sponsors for over the course of just 24 months. And then reinvestment. So bringing that hard fought sponsored money to come into investigator initiated studies. And then the other thing I would say is, I'm sure I'm not alone in this room in being rather unsuccessful with NHMRC and MRF funding. The funding rates, for example, in the last round of NHMRC clinical trials funding, I think was 7% or 6.9%. There is the opportunity for some units, especially if they are well set up and doing a lot of sponsored research, to approach pharma to ask for investigator-initiated studies. And we've been successful in that regard in terms of global grants that are pharma-sponsored investigator-initiated studies. They still give you a lot of flexible, a lot of freedom, and a lot shorter application times and windows. This is just my last slide. We were asked to talk about enablers and barriers. I think that this is just my thoughts, not anything more systematic and thematic analysis or anything like that. But I think that one of the enablers that we have at the Mater, and I would say that at the Mater, there is some flexibility that might not exist at Metro South as far as smaller scales and personal relationships with various offices. So I think that first off and foremost is having engaged patients in your clinic. That's critical. And as clinicians, we can help engage that. I thought that the barrier about it not being a key performance indicator within departments is really telling. And I think that that is reflected in what the clinical activity is. If the goal of a clinical unit is to see as many patients as possible at the least amount of cost possible, which is the Queensland health model, then there's no point for research in that. So that's a problem. And I'm glad that you recognize it or identified it as being one of the problems. So engaged patients and engaged researchers embedded units is fabulous. Motivated research staff and investigators. And then I found it particularly useful to have personal relationships with governance and agreements office in particular. At Mater, they're down the hall from where our office is. We can stop in, say hi, and I would encourage anyone else. A box of chocolates can go a long way with your local governance officer or agreements. And sponsored research. I think that there is momentum that builds once you have a unit that's done successful trials, word gets out on the street. I don't know what their network is, but as you do more work, you get more and more invitations to participate in trials, and gives you the opportunity to be more selective, which is fabulous. We do have people at the Mater, for example, who go out and try to find trials for us. And I find that I heard about them usually before they have in most of those situations. So as you build your profile, you get momentum, which is great. I think that was the comment about having track records and things like that. As far as barriers, we originally had the unit embedded in the hospital, and that turned out not to be an ideal situation. We've now since moved out into a research institute, and that gives us a lot more flexibility, particularly around finance. The finance system at the hospital is very complicated, and they have a system where everything has to equal zero at the end of the books. I think it's an accounting strategy where you have a balanced budget or something like that. But that means that if you make more money one year, then it goes away. And you don't have any ability to use that for longer term projects. So if you have a profit in a year, you can't spend it on things the following year. That didn't work. And so that was frustrating. And also on the administrative side, for example, when we were doing our infusions in the hospital, a nurse refused to give an infusion because it was labeled drug or placebo. It's a double-blind study. They said they're not allowed to give anything that's not labeled with the actual contents. And so, and then that got escalated all the way up to nursing admin. And they said that's out of scope of nursing practice. So we're not allowed to be given by clinical nurses at hospitals. That went to a committee, then never got anywhere. So now we have research nurses who give our drugs, and it's all fine. I think that for investigator-initiated studies, when you have multi-center studies where agreements and there's IP involved, these agreements can be very complicated and take a long period of time. We're doing one investigator-initiated study at 23 sites around Australia, and it was 36 months to get all the agreements in place for those sites. The study itself is only 2 years long. There's limited funding, as I said, opportunities for IASs through traditional means, and I think it's important to be able to work around those barriers. So that was my thing. This is my team at our recent retreat that we had up at New. So they're all very happy in that picture, at least. So thanks very much. Okay, perfect.
Perfect timing, Jake. Thank you. So a slightly different tack now. We're going to look broader than Queensland to Australia and New Zealand via the Australasian Clinical Trials Network. And I'm very glad that Donna Riedlinger at very short notice has agreed to, I'm sure more than ably colourful, Carmel Hawley to tell us about the trials and tribulations. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm sorry Carmel couldn't be here today. She was unexpectedly called away, but I'll try and do a good job. I've worked with Carmel for about 12 years at the network. So a lot of these things that she's experienced and in her presentation, we've experienced together. So today I'll just give a quick background on the AKTN, talk about some of the enablers and barriers, specific probably to Brisbane mostly. And then Carmel's put down some key learnings from her experience of 16 years operating a clinical trials network. So the idea or the origins of the AKTN actually came out of the IDEAL trial, which ran for about 10 years. And during the running of this trial, there was a real desire from the research group to keep the core skills and the knowledge that had been built up over the course of the trial. Usually it's just dismantled at the end of a trial. And so a call went out for a bid to establish an enabling infrastructure for kidney trials, and Carmel won it over Sydney and other places. So it was a really big deal for Brisbane back in the early 2000s to have the opportunity to establish this network. So why would we need a network for investigator-initiated trials? And that's really our core business. We focus on that more than anything. The idea of the network is to actually increase the quality, efficiencies and numbers of investigator-initiated trials. They're trials that are public good trials that wouldn't be done otherwise, and they're patient-centered. So that's really our focus. So you've got the researcher has managed to be successful with the grant. They're very happy with that. And during the trial setup stage, there's quite a few things they need to do. They need to be across everything. Not only do they need to be good scientists and trialists, they also need to be across good clinical practice requirements and the standards required to successfully run clinical trials with patient safety and data integrity in mind. So as you can see, there's quite a few things that need to happen. And typically, even though we write in grants, these, we'll do this in 3 months, typically this takes about 12 months. And by the time you get to recruitment, you've probably already varied your grant once with the funder and, applied for it to be extended another 12 months. And the recruitment starts, and there's a lot of things that the researcher has to be across, which we all know, we all live this. And the last two presenters, Anna and Jake, have really touched on a lot of the barriers that we've experienced as well. And I think that for the researcher trying to traverse these things, it must be really, really daunting. And our team actually takes on a lot of this, which I'll go into later. And then at the end of the trial, you analyse the data and you publish, but you've also got to be planning for dissemination. You've got to think about implementation as well. And about now the grant ends, about publication time, your grant ends, and it doesn't stop. So after the funding finishes, the researcher has to have an appropriate data sharing policy and an adjudication process to fill the data sharing requests. If a request is accepted, you've got to then probably enter into some contracts and transfer the data set securely. And then afterwards, think about where you're going to put that data and who's going to have access to it for the next, however many years, and who's going to manage that data set. And you want your research to have impact. So you need to be thinking about implementation activities and measuring that impact. And this all happens without any funding. So the AKTN, our infrastructure, as I said, is to conduct investigator-initiated trials. And our research ideas come from the community in a shared priority process with our consumer partners who are wonderful. Once it's been through our governance process and it's assessed to be of importance to our community, the trial management procedures start, or the machinery of the AKTN really starts rolling. The management committee is responsible for the trial design and study protocol, but alongside that, our team is looking for funding. We usually look for local or small pots of funding to get some data to inform a larger trial. And that goes in once we're successful with that. Note the positive spin, once we're successful. We then take on the role of sponsor responsibilities through UQ, and we also act as the coordinating centre during the GCP monitoring and all the other regulatory and contracting stuff that goes along with running a clinical trial. There's always issues that we address in consultation with the investigators. Our team sets up the meetings, we set up the safety and steering committees, and all the way through to publication. And as I just alluded to before, it then continues after publication with the implementation stage. So far we've reported 11 trials. We've got 8 recruiting or in the final stages of follow-up, and we've got 5 that we're frantically trying to get up and running this year, funded to commence in 2021. Some of the barriers that we've come across have been spoken about by the other 2 presenters, but our infrastructure, because we really focus on the public good trials, is supported entirely by our own funding, our grant writing efforts. But there's no benefit back to our unit in terms of secondary gains, and that process is a bit opaque, so that's been a barrier. There's also limited institutional infrastructure and knowledge of the sponsor responsibilities to support our clinical trials. I think there's a focus instead on lab research. And our clinicians have a high workload, which is rarely backfilled, and it's tacked on to their full clinical load a lot of the times. We have institutional policies and procedures that are not really fit for purpose for secondment opportunities for people who work at Queensland health facilities. And there's a shortage of skilled technical staff, which is exacerbated by our need to give them short-term research contracts. And institutionally, there's no compliant database or management system that we can tap into. Innovation's not funded by the government grants, often not funded, not always, but we have experienced that in trial design, the reviewers don't understand. There are data collection inefficiencies, and one of the huge barrier that we've had to overcome is the trying to get access to secondary data sources, particularly MBS and PBS, and state by state linkage is difficult. Ethics and governance, excuse me, sorry. The ethics and governance requirements for multi-centre research. We found in this risk-averse environment, there's additional indemnity requirements from the HREX, even at Metro South, asking for indemnity for even their own sites, which is highly unusual. And as others have said, the outputs aren't a performance indicator for our institutional leaders. Some of the enablers, though, that we've come across, the support that we receive for contracts, legal support, and our administrating of the funds is fantastic. And we also benefit greatly from the insurance and indemnity policies that our university has. We've been successful in tapping into the MRFF funding for health and medical research. That's been great for our investigator-initiated research. We've got relationships with the health services and partnerships, and support via the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance and other academic trial centres over the years, including the George Institute and the NHMRC Clinical Trial Centre. We also benefit from now, after so long, making all the mistakes. We're now pretty much the trials leader for investigator-initiated kidney research in this region. And that successful infrastructure has a life of its own, and we're finding we're getting a real reputation with our publications, and people are approaching us to do research, which is fabulous. We've done it with little or no financial support, but it's offset by the huge engagement from our kidney care community, and particularly the consumer partnerships that we've spent a lot of time developing across all our research activities. And Carmel's put down a couple of the key learnings that we've come over 16 years of operation, that running clinical trials is as complex as a lab. You can't just put the team in a group of offices. We do need to have specialist facilities. We need the drug room, we need the freezer space and the dock. And it's years and years of training and mentoring to actually have a team that is capable of overcoming the different things that are thrown up to you during the course of running a clinical trial, and also developing the next generation of clinical researchers. The complex governance and regulatory landscape means that you really do have to have a team that's got expertise across all the aspects. And as I said, that takes years to build. And these skills that my team has particularly, they're not necessarily disease specific. They are readily transferable across to any sort of medical research. Essential to have backfill, which has been difficult for our group, and we need to be pragmatic in our designs, more adaptive and platform trials. We're heading that way now, a move to using secondary data sources more and more for efficiencies and cost savings. And we need to have national connections as well. That's been very important. So my last slide, just to go over the AKTN model again. We've built it from the ground up and we led the way for others. It was a path less traveled, but the model that we have after these 16 years, it's scalable and it's internationally recognized. It's ready to go. It's got everything under one roof. We've got the operating procedures and the all the measures in place to ensure a successful trial. And we've got wonderful expert and experienced clinical trial staff as well. So I feel very lucky. I think Jake alluded to the passion in his team, and I think that our team is like that as well. You'd have to be to stay in it. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
So thank you, Donna, and thank you to Anna and Jake. I might ask the three of you to come up and choose a stool, as we're going to have a panel discussion now. And in addition to the three speakers that you've met already, I'd also like to invite Helen Benham, who's recently taken over as Director of Clinical Trials for TRI, and Rahul Ladwa, from medical oncology, who's quite extensive experience in running clinical trials in oncology. Now, we've got a lot of people in the room, but also quite a deal of people online, and I'm going to do my best to make sure that the people online are included as best as possible in the discussion. But it may just mean that questions will need to be repeated for the sake of the people online, so that they can feel that they're engaged and part of the discussion. So I might just throw it over to the panel. Any questions perhaps that you've got for the speakers who've already gone before? Rahul and Helen, have you got any questions for our first three speakers, just to get the ball rolling?
I might go first if that's all right. So fantastic talk, by the way. I really enjoyed listening to those, and it's nice to see such experience, because I'm an early career researcher. So obviously I'm going through some of these steps currently. The bit I really was interested in is the investigator-initiated research. So we recently got some pharmaceutical sponsorship to run a trial. And you talk about networks, but if we're trying to run through Metro South as a sponsor, it adds an extra element of complexity, I've got to say, from my initial experience. So what have you got an experience from running an investigator-initiated research without going through a network, for example? Do you have any comments about that?
Sorry. You can take the first pass. I can also have some comments at the end.
Looks like that might be a question for you, Donna.
Is that working? Sorry.
Yes.
So our network was formed because of the difficulties in finding adequate support for the sponsorship responsibilities. And being that we've been around for 16 years, when we first started, we really had to develop our own resources and to be our own sponsor, although we were under the auspices of the university, but there was no infrastructure at all at that stage. So I think that it wasn't there, so we built it. Yeah.
Do you think things have changed since you started the initiative?
It's heading that way, most definitely. I think the MRFF, with that pool of funding specific to clinical trial research, has really made the bean counters sit up and notice, which is really usually a motivator for large institutions. So.
And I guess I would just say that the BDHP Partners in Brisbane is an organization that can help to do this on a small scale, at least in the area. And then sometimes I would say there's also some national organizations that you can tap into, whichever. Yes.
Any questions from the floor or from online? People online, probably the best thing is to put the question in the Q&A. We've got over 90 people I can see online, so please feel free to put your question in the Q&A. I can see a question down the back. So if you can speak up in a big, loud voice, and then we'll repeat the question for, yes.
My name is Suzanne Elliott from the Medical Research Foundation. The National Clinical Governance required a big section on consumer engagement. I think probably investigator-initiated studies probably have a better opportunity for consumer engagement. How does everybody deal with it with sponsor clinical research and facilities mainly dealing with sponsor trials? And it may go down not just necessarily hospitals, but other private, public, and other kind of site clinical trial units. How do they engage the consumer when there may be sponsor?
So I'm just going to paraphrase your question for the sake of the people online, because they won't be able to hear. So the question is all around consumer engagement, and our question has made the point that that's often done relatively well, or to some degree with the investigator-initiated studies. But question to the panel is how do you tackle consumer engagement with the sponsored trials?
I can take one little step at that, which is I think it's actually not done very well, and it probably could be done a lot better. These trials, at least the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, tend to be global trials that are done at multiple centers on multiple continents around the world. And the consumer in that setting, I guess, is the company going out into their marketing people and deciding what the consumers want. But at our local center, we have a consumer panel, and we talk to our consumer panel about trials that are done at a local site level. I'm not sure actually about the national level and how active, like, for example, lead sites for Australian studies, how they're handling it.
Because the hospitals are going to have to demonstrate that as part of their accreditation.
Yeah, so we panel a consumer panel at our hospital to run trials through. But that's at a site level. I don't know about national trials.
So there are a couple of opportunities to involve consumers, I guess, even in those cases. What we will try to do is actually look at tapping into existing mechanisms for us to obtain consumer feedback. So from trial participation point of view, and actually try and use that information to improve how we provide the support for clinical trials and how we conduct the clinical trials. That will inform some of our ethics and governance work as well. Another opportunity is to actually engage them in terms of prioritising which trials we are willing to accept or take on board as part of our health service. So that's probably the two opportunities that I see with respect to engaging consumers.
So, sorry, for our group, we've had to build that.
So, sorry, Donna, we're not getting any audio.
Oh, sorry, that better?
That's better.
I don't know why. Sorry. Yeah, so we've had, the university doesn't actually have an infrastructure for that, but they're working on it as well. So,
Ranjani, did you have a question?
One of the MRFF priorities has been Australian sites for international trials, and I wondered if anyone had experience with those grants.
So the question's around MRFF funding for Australian sites of international studies. Have I got that right? Yeah. Donna, do you want to?
I can just answer. From our point of view, we have looked at and we have planned to put in a grant, but it's very restrictive. and you can't actually access those funds unless the international partners also have funding as well, and there's a lot of work. So no, we haven't actually gone down that road yet. We've been mainly in the unmet needs category. We've been quite successful, and yeah, the rare cancers, rare diseases.
We've tried for one unsuccessfully for a European trial that we were trying to bring to Australia from a investigator-initiated study. That one ran into trouble on, it was a pharma-sponsored investigator-initiated study, and that ran into trouble where they were looking for something that was grant-funded, not pharma-funded for whatever reason.
I've had experience as well. I'm still waiting the outcome, but the problem is extremely restricted. It has to be phase 3 clinical trials, and it's actually one of the least supported NHS initiatives. And I thought there really needs to be some reworking, because I think there is actually scope to do phase 1 and phase 2, and that's much more than phase 3.
I've got a question online, or a couple of questions online, in fact. The first one is directed to Anna. And this person, who's anonymous, says, great work on the gap analysis for Metro South Health Service. Do you think that the ACS QHC RG framework will speed up research governance? I'm doubtful, as it is more about lifting standards as opposed to simplifying. Does that make sense to you?
I presume they're talking about the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. And I do think that it does have potential to actually complicate things in a lot of ways, particularly because we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to collect some of this data. But at the same time, it's a great opportunity for us to actually establish those processes, to have a better oversight of how we conduct clinical trials, and really the focus on making those improvements and being very honest with ourselves as to what some of our issues may be. It is probably important to note that some of that information will be publicly available. So once we go through that accreditation process, information about maturity of health services with respect to those requirements of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework will be available online. So what that will mean, it has potential to impact on our reputation, both positively and negatively. It also has potential to actually make some of our research more visible to our consumers as well. So I do think that there are a number of phenomenal benefits that we can actually draw from that work, but it may be a bit challenging to start off with.
There's another question online from Alison Pettit from the Marta. Alison asks, it was mentioned that the time to actually navigate the setup and administrative aspects is lengthy and frequently underestimated, and I think we'd all agree with that. Alison asked, is there any low effort early actions or strategies that can be put in place prior to confirmation of trial funding that will streamline or accelerate the process? Donna, you're looking enthusiastic to answer that.
So I think we've learned that there will always be something thrown up to you that you don't anticipate. However, we do have a pretty robust process where the the research team does a lot of the legwork in the early part of it. But remembering that this is unfunded, so it has to be found sort of outside the normal arrangements that you have with grant funding. I think that we do. I think having your workforce engaged and robust policies under that underpinning their work really helps as well. But inevitably, it takes 12 months. I know that. I always have to tell the CIs who have their grant starts on the 1st of June and they want to kickstart on the 1st of September, and I always have to be the bad news person and say, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen.
Maybe I would just add in one thing, which is that we are part of a consortium, as I mentioned, around Australia, and we have an existing collaborative research agreement in place. And at least for investigator-initiated studies, they can piggyback on this collaborative research agreement. So you have a lot of those data transfer agreements and material transfer agreements that are already in place, and that makes life easier because it's going to take a long time to negotiate from the ground up.
That's right. And I think from a health service point of view as well, we are really trying to focus on what the real issues are. It's no longer about really having that separation between the administrative side of things and the research community and the research world, I should say. But it's about bringing those together and talking to each other to actually create meaningful improvements.
and you'll be aware that in some places people have trialled things like a research valet in the research office, who essentially have one point of contact, and that person guides that one study through the ethics, through the governance, through the contracts and negotiation, so that you don't have silly situations where it sits in one spot for a while and then eventually find its way over here and bounces around, and enormous amounts of time are wasted. So that's something that we're actively looking at in Metro South, just to make the whole process a lot more faster. Helen, no one's picked on you yet. You've just come in recently as the Director of Clinical Trials for TRI. What are some of the sort of low-hanging fruit items that are on your radar to address from the TRI perspective that can improve clinical trial activity, not just the volume, but maybe the quality, the speed of clinical trials? What are some of the ideas you've got at the moment?
Well, I think first to say that I'm not sure people realise how active TRI is in this space. So TRI has 2 clinical trials research facilities. One is the CRF, which we engage Metro South to run. It is a TRI clinical research facility. And then we have the TRI research facility over at the Children's Hospital, which is called TRIC. The CRF runs about 170 trials through, and the TRIC currently has about 60 trials, 40 of which are active. We also have, for the last 3 years, which has been developing over the last 3 years, is the Translational Trials team, which is actually an end-to-end service to really assist PIs, particularly those in the health services, to overcome some of the barriers that we've been talking about. So Translational Trial Service currently has, Steve's in the audience, he'll probably correct me on the numbers, but over the past 3 years, about 100 trials, has about 20 active trials at the moment, about 10 to 20 in startup. And that's really improved in areas where PIs in the hospital might not have any experience. And this is particularly in the commercial sponsored trials, phase 3 trials, where you kind of get drugs to patients. So we've been able to help PIs in the respiratory space, in the ophthalmology space, and infectious diseases, outside of the generally big trials like kidney trials, like cancer trials, and otherwise, that already have a great deal of infrastructure and support around them. So I would encourage anybody in the audience who's actually looking for help in terms of clinical trial work to reach out to the Translational Trials Unit. In regards to where we're going, so there's lots of talk in this space in Southeast Queensland about what to do in clinical trials in Southeast Queensland and in Queensland in general. So UQ currently have a large scoping exercise, which they're looking into in regards to clinical trials. BDHP are looking in the space, and Queensland Health, of course, are also. And the difficulty is, of course, in what all the presenters have said, is that clinical trial is not just a clinical trial. Phase 1 trial is very different to a phase 3 trial. Immunotherapy first in human trial is very different to a cohort study across the country that's investigator driven. And so we're actually not talking about apples. We're talking about apples and oranges often, and it's a complicated space. However, there are certain parts of running trials that are common to everybody. And so it's a matter of harnessing, at least in our geographical areas, I think, the capacity to do things. And that's really about navigation, John, and you mentioned a research advisor or otherwise, but it's about helping potential and actual PIs and clinical researchers and those that want to do clinical trials navigate through who can help them. Maybe that's AKTN, maybe that is the Translational Trials team, maybe that is the Cancer Trials Unit in the Metro in the PA. So it's leveraging what's already out there, I think, John, is what we need to start to do.
So I've got a few more questions online. Someone is asking, is there a need to have a Queensland Centre for Clinical Trials, a sort of a coordinating centre across the state? Is that going to add to or subtract to what we're doing already? Rahul or Helen, do you want to buy into that?
I don't know, I'll let you go first.
Again, this is a topic of discussion which appears to be on everyone's lips at the moment. I mean, of course, a centralised body would be fantastic, but who is that body? right? Is that Queensland Health? Is that one of the large universities? Is that Mater Research? Who takes ownership of that arrangement? And my personal feeling is that there's no way we could come to a consensus unless that's externally funded by, you know, a national body or whatever that might be. And so I think there needs to be a better coordination and potentially an overarching service that provides more navigation and more capacity around clinical trials in Queensland. You know, we actually deliver, MTP had a report, Queensland delivers 21% of all of the clinical trials in the country, which without a lot of infrastructure, actually in comparison to Victoria and New South Wales, which are about 27%. So we still deliver on a lot of clinical trials, but I think everyone would agree it's in a uncoordinated, disjointed kind of manner, but I don't know what the answer is in terms of a central body.
I think the one thing that I might just add on to that is a equity question, where most of the clinical trials activity, we do a lot, and I would say it's almost entirely in Brisbane, and that we are really not doing a great service in terms of clinical trial access to the rest of the state, and that a solution that can bring in those patients would be greatly appreciated. COVID, in fact, may make this whole thing possible, where face-to-face visits are becoming de-emphasized. We're doing a lot of home visits now and things like that, which might make it possible finally.
There's certainly an emphasis on telehealth trials as well nowadays. I know
Do you want to speak about teletrials in particular?
I haven't done any myself, actually, but I know our Cancer Trials Unit have been running a few of the telehealth trials, working with Townsville's and other sites in terms of having a principal investigator each side and recruiting from regional centres, for example, which is really nice to give an opportunity to patients outside of Brisbane. I certainly have quite a few patients that fly in from Cairns and other places to see me in trials. It's nice to give them an option closer to home.
So for those of you that aren't aware, here the HERO office in the health department got funding from federal government to develop the teletrial model a little bit. They're still in the, I guess, in the build phase and working out what it might look like, but they've really been tasked with developing clinical trials, particularly for patients, as you say, living in rural or remote areas, so that there is some more equity of access and allow people who live hundreds of kilometres from, you know, major centres on the eastern seaboard still to be involved in clinical trials. Norbert, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering, what about phase 1 trials? I mean, given that what Hal mentioned, you know, you need more appetite for risk. Maybe also you can get less revenue. So, what is the what is the RI's perspective on that? Because I mean, I my experience with a phase 1, 2 trials in cancer space. Very much.
Yeah, so they're a different kettle of fish, aren't they? And as you know, a number of Mater, for example, has quite a boutique phase 1 clinical trial set up, unit or otherwise. TRI is committed to increasing its capacity across all of the phases of clinical trials. And that's going to be tricky, and we have to do that in partnership with Metro South because they run our CRF. But there is definite will and commitment on our behalf to start seeing a broader, a greater depth of trials, and those that are more difficult to do, which are in fact investigator driven in phase 1. And we don't do any healthy control work, you know, healthy volunteer trials at all in CRF, and that's a very big step for us to take. The biggest issue that doesn't get talked about with clinical trials is the cost. Right, it is extremely costly to do clinical trials. The back end is that they're actually also extremely lucrative if you do sponsored trials. And so the commercial reality of doing clinical trials means that you have to leverage on the commercial sponsors, and Jacob has, you know, alluded to this, and we need to start doing that on a bigger scale, so that we can do things that are more costly and more difficult to do and have less funding in that space. The commercial reality of that, I think, is quite clear, because there's only going to be a certain pot of money that investigators can get from the NHMRC and indeed the MRFF, although that has improved things.
We managed to get to phase 1 related trial and a lot of science and the health being hospitals. Well, it's amazingly incredibly fast and we absolutely haven't taken a year for government to get paperwork to get done. So is the solution once the pandemic's done, just get all the trials from the coronavirus? Because that was an incredibly, in that situation, fast process. So our other systems unnecessarily complicated and slow.
I think yes is the answer, but there was also a lot of money thrown at that problem, right? So it does come back to the commercial reality of how much everything costs. And there was an infinite pool of money available to the coronavirus trials. That's the reality. But yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, regulation and otherwise, whilst it still proceeded, was fast-tracked. I'm sure others have comments on it.
So I do think that it is fantastic to see that both nationally and statewide, I guess locally, we're looking at improving some of those processes. So it's no longer just about the individual facilities and health services. We're seeing a real push for, and I guess recognition of the delays that ethics and governance in particular have caused. And we will have, I believe, within a year or two, a very different landscape from that point of view, because we will have appropriate measures, we will have transparency, we will have different approaches in that space.
My comment on that is that institutions tend to focus a lot on risk, but when you're thinking about a clinical trial, you have to think about what's the risk of doing a clinical trial, but what's the risk of not doing a clinical trial?
Right.
What's the risk to the patients? What's the risk to the reputation of the organisation? Now, if the Courier Mail puts on page 3 that the PA Hospital and TRI are holding up life-saving therapy by fluffing around with contracts for 12 or 18 months, that's not that's a reputational risk to the organisation. And so I think you have to think about risk from a broad perspective, from a patient perspective, from a researcher perspective, sure, from a clinical service perspective. But if you have a much broader view, I think that can help people focus on what are the important issues. And I totally agree that COVID made people realise that a lot of the stuff they've been fluffing around about was really fluffing around. Ranjini, maybe we better make this the last question because we're running out of time. So.
Yes, so just in hearing all of the speakers, people have all focused on the team and the importance of the workforce and the instability of the workforce. So I wonder if we're nowhere near getting the clinical trials centre, whether trying to get a stable workforce who's well trained and who has flexibility with contracts might be the place to try to get to without having to go all the way to the trial centre.
I know that at Metro South that is exactly what we're aiming for. And I mentioned earlier about a person that's going to be responsible, really a conduit between the sponsors and our health service. We want to really facilitate that conversation and help researchers navigate that field. We want to take advantage of opportunities that arise for our health service as well. In addition to that, we're also looking at really building up our clinical trials, clinical research coordinator space as well, so that some of that administrative work can be taken away from our very busy clinicians. So that we're taking a multi-pronged approach with that.
Just on that comment, one of the reasons why I wanted to do a Metro South sponsored investigator-initiated research is the fact that we have a wonderful hospital, we have excellent patients, we have opportunities, fantastic resources, clinical trials unit, we have a TRI and researchers all around us. I've got expertise. We can do a fantastic investigator-sponsored trial all within our sort of limits, right within our reach. And I think going through the process once for me is going to be really important, because once you go through it, at least you can teach somebody else how to go through it and the pitfalls that you can't come against. And I think that's really important because it opens up the dialogue, the communications, and hopefully next time will be easier, if there is a next time.
Yeah, and I'd have to agree, because I think in my presentation I talked about having to dismantle that expertise every single time and then build it up again when you get another grant is really crueling what we do. And we talked earlier about how long it takes to get a trial up and running, and most of that is the institutional barriers that we come across. So my workforce can have all the talent and everything in place, but it needs to be fixed at that next level to enable it. And having a dedicated workforce at the hospital that has the appropriate skills and knowledge and don't act as gatekeepers would really help that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We've run a little bit over time, but I think that's because there's been some interesting discussion, and I apologise to the people online. We haven't got to all of the questions, but we've nonetheless had some great speakers and some great comments from our panel. So please join me in thanking the panellists and speakers for today.